been a big week in Australian foreign policy terms with the civil conflict in Iraq, the Prime Minister on his first trip to North America, and the Foreign and Defence Ministers in Japan finding new areas of military cooperation. On our political forum tonight, I was joined in the studio by James Brown, Military Fellow at the LOWY Institute. Previously, he served as an officer with the Australian Army, including in Iraq, where he worked on the Australian Task Force headquarters in Baghdad. My other guest was Tom Switzer, editor of Spectator Australia and research associate at the United States Studies Centre at the University of Sydney, where he lectures in US politics. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us.
Good evening.
The PM's first trip to North America, what was achieved, Tom Switzer?
I think all things considered it was a success, but I would say that about most prime ministerial visits to Washington. I think as impressive as the Prime Minister's meetings with the President this morning were, I have been struck that they have not been overshadowed by a comment made on this program last night by the Defence Minister, David Johnston. He was prompted by Tony Jones, what would the Australian position be? Would the ANZUS alliance apply to Australia in the event of any Sino-American conflict? And he said it wouldn't. Now, that is a huge story, and it hasn't been picked up by the press. 10 years ago, Alexander Downer said the same thing in Beijing, answering a hypothetical question from an ABC journalist, and he was pounded on. He was denounced by the Americans, privately of course. The Labor Shadow Foreign Affairs spokesperson slammed Downer, and many newspaper columnists really attacked Downer. That hasn't happened in this case. It's quite intriguing, and I think it reflects a sea change in the Sino-American-Australian relationship. Now,
we are going to talk about those relations and Japan more specifically and those comments from David Johnston, but let's just stick to Tony Abbott's trip to North America in isolation for the minute, and we'll put that on hold. What's your impression of what was achieved, James Brown?
Well, there are obviously some things overshadowing this visit, the fact that they're on separate sides of the partisan divide. But this visit, I thought, looked and felt right. It didn't feel too much like an Australian leader fawning over a US leader. They appeared to be standing on terms as equals. They've managed to ink some of the detail on some of the enhanced military arrangements that Australia and the US are looking at proceeding with. And it seems like the Prime Minister came away with most of the things that he aimed for.
OK, Tom Switzer, we'll get now to the Japan-Australia strategic partnership. It's being strengthened. Japan will become Australia's closest military partner next to the US. First of all, before we get on to the ANZUS treaty, which we'll discuss, what are the implications of us moving closer to Japan? What are the implications of that for our relationship with China?
Well, the Defence Minister says that it's just the resumption of a normal defence posture on the Japanese part, which is true, but it's also true that the Japanese are spending a lot on drones and submarines and other technology. And Abe, the Prime Minister, is talking a hawkish language over the tensions with China in the North China Sea, East China Sea. I think it makes more sense for Australia to be a bit more nuanced, ambiguous, qualified in its enthusiasm for Japan. It is a strong trade relationship with Australia, but so does the People's Republic of China, and I think that's the big issue that's taken place over the last 10 years, the fact that you've got this rise of China, our largest trading partner. We have our largest and most important strategic ally being the United States, and the treaty relationships in East Asia. But Australia is increasingly needing to learn to ride two horses simultaneously, and that's a very delicate diplomatic feat.
Yes, well, James Brown, shortly after taking office, Tony Abbott held talks with Shinzo Abe in which we all know he described the Japanese PM as Australia's best friend in Asia. We now have a free trade agreement with Tokyo and deeper defence and security ties, but a recent LOWY poll, I noticed, found that actually the Australian public thinks China is Australia's better buddy.
Well, when you ask questions about foreign policy to Australians, they tend to be pretty pragmatic. We love the US alliance overwhelmingly, but we don't want to fight with the US unless we can, unless we really have to. And although more than 40% of Australians think China will be a military threat in the next 20 years, we also think they're our best friend in Asia, just tipping out Japan. So a lot of paradoxes there. I think it makes a lot of sense for Australia to do some things on the security front with Japan, but we need to be careful of just what the Japanese are looking for us to do in return. So cooperating with the Japanese on submarine technology, deepening some of the interoperability between the US, Australia and Japan at sea makes sense. I think we should be very supportive of Japan lifting some of the restrictions on their military. They're not rearming, they already have a very large military, and they have some very real threats day to day from Russia and China probing their airspace and sea lanes. For them, though, they're trying to overcome some really silly, impractical restrictions on what their military is actually able to do. I think we should be supportive of that, but we don't want to create any false expectations about what Australia might or might not be willing to do for Japan in a conflict with China.
Well, let's get to that. Defence Minister David Johnston says Australia is urging countries in the East China Sea and South China Sea to resolve their disputes pursuant to international law. What if they don't?
Well, this is a real issue, and the history of international relations indicates that great powers as they rise, including the United States in the 19th century, start to assert themselves. They try to seek a sphere of influence. And their definition of the national interests grows. There's nothing really wrong with this. This is just the nature of power politics. And despite the fact that some figures in the Obama administration think this is a very 19th century view of the world, the fact is that those age-old principles of power politics remain very valid in the 21st century, as we've seen in Russia. So I think China will increasingly be more assertive in the world. Of course, there is a chance that China will be so consumed by internal problems, demographic, environmental, they may even have a severe economic downturn, in which case they're more likely to be self-absorbed than act aggressively. But if they are as assertive as many leading foreign policy realists, including Henry Kissinger, John Mearsheimer, Hugh White, have indicated, then China's rise is bound to be very messy in the region, and that puts a lot of stress and strain on countries in the region, especially countries like Australia that have a rapidly developing trade and commercial relationship with China. We export 7-to-1 ratio more to China than we do to the United States. And, these are real genuine concerns when it comes to how you manage these two relations.
How do you see this playing out, James Brown?
Well, a year ago we used to talk about the possibility of Chinese assertiveness. Now we're seeing 76 Chinese ships battering and ramming Vietnamese ships around the Paracel Islands. A year ago we used to say this isn't a coordinated strategy, it's local level commanders getting out of line. Now we know that it's a coordinated strategy. A year ago we used to talk about the possibility of ASEAN nations coming together to come up with a code of conduct for these kinds of incidents. Now we're relying on countries like the Philippines going to international arbitration. And we used to talk about the possibility of conflict. Now we're living through low-level skirmishing and conflict. So none of the signs are good. There are all sorts of reasons for China to maintain a proper navy, to maintain its search for resources. But what we're missing in Asia is some sort of conflict resolution mechanism. We have lots of meetings and lots of dialogues, but we don't seem to get much result. The UN Security Council is missing in action when it comes to these conflicts. We're really missing something that could come up with some sort of long-lasting solution.
Before we get on to a discussion about Iraq, just want to try to clarify here the issue of the ANZUS Treaty. Is it clear to you, Tom Switzer, when it's triggered and in what circumstances?
Johnson last night, I think, deviated from the mainstream position in both major parties. He said to Tony Jones that the ANZUS alliance would not apply in the event of a Sino-American stoush. Now, this is quite significant because Australia is the only nation in the world that has supported the United States in every major conflict in the last century. World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and of course more recently in the Persian Gulf. He shouldn't have said that. He should have been pounced as well, and the Prime Minister should be asked to clarify those comments, just as Prime Minister Howard had to clarify Alexander Downer's gaffe in August of 2004 in Beijing. You just need to be nuanced, be ambiguous, make the point that the US alliance is a centrepiece of Australian foreign policy, but you don't need to make those kind of grand proclamations.
I don't want to run out of time, so let's get on to the discussion about the shocking events in Iraq this past week. How surprising was it, James Brown, to see such a swift capitulation by the Iraqi army and police force in the face of this attack by the group known as ISIS or ISIL?
Well, there's been concerns about the capability and also the will of the Iraqi army and Iraqi security forces for some time. I don't think we expected them to be an incredibly professional force, but the speed of their collapse in some of these cities has been quite surprising. What hasn't been surprising is the fact that Iraq is once again subject to levels of horrific violence. I think it's just faded from our attention. I mean, looking at the occasional report from Baghdad and Iraq over the last few months, you see reports that 35 people have been killed in bombings in Baghdad, and it sort of passes without much comment here in Australia. So we're now in a situation where you have a government in Iraq that doesn't seem to have the will to convene its own parliament, let alone to get its soldiers to go out and fight. You've got a group that seems to be gaining momentum, but will struggle to hold the cities that they've taken, will struggle to keep their logistics together, to stop themselves from falling into a rabble, and I don't think will end up posing a serious threat to Baghdad.
Tom Switzer?
The regime in place had essentially been running the show for generations, first under the Ottoman Empire, then under the Hashemites, and then under the Ba'athist dictatorship. It was an unpleasant regime, but once that authoritarian, brutal order collapsed, you then had the breakdown in order. And that meant you had all these age-old ethnic and tribal tensions resurface. And we have to remember Iraq is an arbitrarily created state after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. It's ethnically and tribally divided. And the government in place there over the last few years, the Maliki government, representing Shia, see themselves as the new winners in this Iraq. And they have been punishing the Sunni minority. And now the chickens are coming home to roost. The Sunni minority, broadly speaking, now feel that they have no representation in the Shia Iraq, and that is why, in large parts, many of the Sunni minority are reaching out to these nasty groups such as Al-Qaeda and extremist elements.
James Brown, the US have spent something in the order of $1.7 trillion in Iraq, and much of that on training and equipment for those troops and the police force. I mean, you know, what do we have to show for it when you look at what's happening there now?
Well, a lot of that equipment that the US has purchased, particularly in Mosul, the Black Hawk helicopters sitting on the flight line there are probably getting destroyed by those ISIS fighters right now. A lot of those very fragile gains in professionalising the Iraqi military will be reversed by this. It will make a huge dent. The dilemma for President Obama is that there's no political will to recommit American ground troops to reverse this. And they would need to recommit in large numbers to be able to push back the tide of ISIS. They'll be able to, I think, provide some limited support as they did in the Libyan conflict, sort of another version of leading from behind, perhaps airstrikes, perhaps intelligence support. But there's just not going to be the will to go back in and protect their investment.
In fact,
yeah, sure.
I was just going to say, President Obama actually spelled it out. He said he doesn't envisage any circumstances in which ground troops could return to Iraq. And Tony Abbott didn't seem quite so definitive, though, when he was asked the same question. The Prime Minister of Iraq has called for friendly countries to assist. What sort of assistance do you imagine might be forthcoming?
I would be very surprised if President Obama, even though he's being egged on by many conservative, hawkish members of Congress to conduct airstrikes and maybe even paratrooper missions into Iraq, just like the French did when they intervened in Mali early last year. I'd find it very hard to believe that President Obama, at a time when the American people are suffering from foreign policy fatigue, they're tired of the world, they have no appetite to go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. And unfortunately, a lot of the critics who are calling on President Obama to get involved are talking as if it's 2002 and 2003.
But, of course, the US Republican Senator John McCain has been at the front of the criticism, and he is the one who was most forthright on the issue of the withdrawal having happened too soon. James Brown, did the US withdraw too soon? Should they have left some kind of residual force to act as a deterrent?
There are certainly arguments about that being made, that there was not enough of an effort made to maintain a status force of agreement that would have allowed them to keep some sort of presence there. These kind of things always happen on a political timeline, just as in Afghanistan the withdrawal is happening ahead of conditions on the ground based on political considerations in the US rather than military considerations on the ground. So I think we can replay that as many times as we want. Could decisions have been made better, differently? The question is now, what does the US do? And every option they've got looks bad. If they talk to the Kurds in the north, they're going to annoy Turkey. If they work with the Shia, they're going to annoy Saudi Arabia. If they try and bring the Sunnis back into some sort of position of power in Iraq, they're going to embolden Assad in Syria. So they cannot take any action without having a consequence somewhere else. It's an incredibly toxic situation, and at the centre of it all is an Iraqi leader who doesn't seem to have the will to govern for all of his people, who's governing like a tribal chief.
And just quickly, because we are out of time, do you think there are lessons here for Afghanistan as far as the withdrawal goes?
Well, I think this will force Obama to take another look at his plan for transition in Afghanistan. He's outlined a plan that is at the lower end of the scale of what his generals asked for. I think he will now be very conscious that he might leave this kind of legacy in Afghanistan as well, that he might pull forces out only to have that situation implode again in 5 or 10 years. So he'll be scrubbing over that Afghan transition plan one more time.
I think the lesson is that democracy is not an export commodity, particularly when you're dealing with arbitrarily created states and ethnically and tribally divided societies. And now the chickens are coming home to roost. I mean, here's the irony. The Americans, the British, and let's face it, we went into Iraq and we took out a cigar-smoking, sound of music-loving, secular, brutal tyrant. And now the legacy is that we have a bunch of terrorists who are creating a safe haven for a new generation of jihadists.
We have to leave it there. There's much more to talk about, and I'm sure we'll come back to you just for that. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Emma, thanks, Emma.